The fire devoured the house with a relentless hunger, crackling as it tore through wooden beams, swallowing walls, and reducing years of a quiet life to smoldering embers. Smoke curled into the sky, thick and choking, carrying away the last remnants of what had once been his home. Isaiah King stood motionless, his dark skin glistening with sweat from the heat, his jaw clenched, his breath steady. He didn't move. He didn't try to salvage anything. There was nothing left to save. The only thing that mattered was already gone. Rex lay motionless on the ground, his once powerful body now limp, his fur darkened with soot, his side marred by a single bullet hole. The shot had been clean, efficient, delivered with the cold precision of someone who didn't hesitate. Not an accident. A message. A challenge. Isaiah crouched beside the body, running a hand through the still warm fur, his fingers tightening as he swallowed the rage clawing at his throat. He had seen death before, had lived in its shadow, but this was different. This was personal. Behind him, sirens wailed, emergency lights flashing against the darkness, their colors bleeding into the night. Voices shouted, neighbors murmured, the distant clicks of phone cameras capturing his ruin for social media. The world moved around him, but Isaiah heard none of it. The weight of loss pressed against his chest, heavy and suffocating, but beneath it, something old and dangerous stirred. He had spent years burying it, locking it away, pretending he could be something other than what he was. But peace had never truly belonged to men like him. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his breath steady despite the fire raging behind him. His muscles ached, but not from exhaustion, from restraint. He had tried to walk away from violence, from the instincts sharpened over years of war, but the past had a way of dragging men back, forcing them to remember who they really were. And tonight the world had reminded him. They had taken his home. They had taken his dog. They had taken the last thing tethering him to a quiet life. He turned toward his car, the only thing untouched by the destruction, its black surface reflecting the chaos behind him. He caught his own reflection in the window, his dark skin glowing in the flickering firelight, his eyes unreadable, empty, yet burning with something deeper. Not grief. Not fear. Purpose. Sliding into the driver's seat, he exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the wheel with a quiet resolve. He had left behind a world of blood and vengeance, had built something new, something almost normal. But they had ripped it away. And now, there was no choice left to make. He reached into the glove compartment, fingers brushing against cool steel, the weight of his past settling back into his grip like an old friend. He hadn't touched a gun in years, but the familiarity of it, the certainty, was comforting in a way he had forgotten. He had tried to be a different man, but men like him didn't get to change. With one last glance at the inferno consuming what little he had left, he started the engine, the low growl of the car cutting through the sirens. He didn't look back. The man who had lived in that house, who had tried to carve out something resembling peace, was dead. In his place, something older had returned. Something ruthless. Something inevitable. Isaiah King had been left with nothing. And now, he was going to take everything. The air inside the underground club was thick with the scent of stale whiskey, sweat, and cigarette smoke, the kind of place where deals were made with whispers and knives, where men drank to forget the sins that had already marked them for death. Isaiah King moved through the haze with the silent precision of a man who belonged here but had spent years pretending he didn't. His dark skin gleamed under the flickering neon light, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the crowd as if he were a phantom slipping between the living. The music pounded, a heavy bass that rattled glasses and bones, but Isaiah wasn't here for the drinks or the music. He was here for information, and there was only one man in this city who knew every secret worth knowing. Samson sat in his usual corner, a worn leather jacket draped over his frail frame, his eyes sunken but sharp, a man who had spent his life navigating the underworld without ever truly being a part of it. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted a glass to his lips, but his gaze didn't waver when he saw Isaiah approach. "Thought you were done with this life," he muttered, setting the drink down with a deliberate slowness, the weight of years pressing into his voice. Isaiah pulled out a chair, leaning forward, his fingers laced together on the table, his presence heavy, unshakable. "They took everything, Samson," he said, his voice even, stripped of anything that resembled emotion. "I need a name." The old man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head as if he had already seen how this story would end, but he didn't hesitate. "Raul Delgado," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the music. "The kid's reckless, trying to prove himself, wants to take his father's empire before the old man keels over." Isaiah's jaw tightened. He had heard the name before, a spoiled prince playing at war, but now it was personal. Before Isaiah could press for more, the first shot shattered the air, the sharp crack of a silencer barely heard over the music but loud enough to send a ripple of tension through the room. The club erupted into chaos as bodies scrambled for cover, drinks spilled, tables overturned, but Isaiah didn't move. He had already seen them, the four men pushing through the crowd, their eyes locked on Samson, their hands already reaching for their weapons. He reacted on instinct, his body a machine that had been dormant for too long but had never forgotten how to kill. The first man barely had time to raise his gun before Isaiah was on him, his hand locking around the wrist, twisting with brutal efficiency, the bones snapping with a sickening crack as the weapon clattered to the floor. A second later, Isaiah drove his elbow into the man's throat, dropping him where he stood. The second attacker fired, the bullet slicing through the air inches from Isaiah's head, but he was already moving, closing the distance before the man could adjust, his fist driving into his ribs with enough force to break something vital. The third hesitated. That was his mistake. Isaiah turned the stolen gun on him and pulled the trigger, the silencer coughing out death before the man could even register his failure. The last man ran. Outside, the night smelled of rain and gasoline, the streets slick with reflections of neon and shadow. Isaiah didn't chase the fleeing man, he had already found something more valuable. Nathan, one of Delgado's errand boys, had lingered too long, watching from the alley, thinking he was invisible. He wasn't. Isaiah's grip locked around his throat before he could run, slamming him against the damp brick wall, his breath hitching in pure, animalistic panic. "Talk," Isaiah ordered, his voice calm, measured, a storm waiting to be unleashed. Nathan's eyes darted, his pulse a frantic drum against Isaiah's fingers. "Raul's making his move," he choked out. "Wants to be king, doesn't care who he burns to get there. Your house, your dog, that was just a warning, he's coming for everyone." Isaiah stared at him, silent, letting the words settle like poison. He could kill him. It would be easy. But fear was a sharper weapon. He loosened his grip, just enough for Nathan to breathe. "Tell Raul," Isaiah said, his voice cold, final, "I'm coming for him." He released the man, watching him collapse onto the wet pavement, coughing, gasping, scrambling to escape. The message had been sent. Isaiah turned, disappearing into the shadows. The hunt had begun. The bounty hit the streets like a wildfire, whispers turning into shouts, every lowlife, mercenary, and desperate killer in the city suddenly watching, waiting, hunting. $5 million. It was enough to make men reckless, enough to turn strangers into executioners, enough to make Isaiah King a moving target in a city that had already betrayed him once. Raul Delgado wasn't hiding anymore. This was a declaration, a message scrawled in blood before the first drop had even been spilled. But Isaiah had spent too many years in the dark to be afraid of men like Raul. He wasn't running. He was waiting. The first ones came quick, sloppy, believing the bounty made them invincible. 4 men in a black SUV, creeping through the streets with the arrogance of men who had never seen real war, never smelled the blood of their own mistakes. They thought they were predators. They didn't know they were prey. Isaiah had watched them circle the block twice, had seen the way the driver's hands tightened on the wheel, the way the man in the passenger seat checked his weapon too many times. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. They never considered that he had set the board himself. The explosion wasn't loud, just enough to rip through the back tire, sending the SUV into a violent spin, slamming into a concrete barrier with a crunch of metal and shattered glass. Before the smoke settled, Isaiah was already moving. The first man stumbled from the wreck, coughing, shaking off the daze, and Isaiah struck. His fist connected with the man's jaw, a sharp crack before the body hit the ground. The second one wasn't as lucky. Isaiah was on him before he could draw, grabbing his wrist, twisting until tendons snapped, then driving him into the pavement with a single, bone-crushing strike. The third fired, but Isaiah had already seen it coming, already shifted, the bullet slicing air where his head had been a second before. He closed the distance, wrapped his hands around the man's throat, and squeezed just long enough to silence him forever. The last one tried to run. Isaiah let him. He needed Raoul to know this wasn't a bounty hunt. This was a war. Somewhere in the city, the news spread. Isaiah King wasn't a ghost. He wasn't in hiding. He was hunting. And that was why she came. Camilla Rains had always moved like she owned the world, her presence cutting through the air with a sharpness that made weaker men uneasy. Isaiah had known her for years, had fought beside her, had bled beside her, had once thought of her as the only person who truly understood what it meant to live on the edge of violence. Now she stood in front of him, arms crossed, eyes cold but calculating, watching him like a puzzle she had already figured out. 5 million, she said, the words slow, deliberate, her voice carrying something close to amusement. Guess you finally pissed off the wrong guy. Isaiah didn't answer, just watched her, waiting. She sighed, shaking her head. You're going after Raoul. You don't have a plan. It wasn't a question. He still didn't answer. She smirked, but there was no humor in it. Lucky for you I do. Camilla had spent years weaving through the same world Raoul played in, but she had one advantage. She knew who really pulled the strings. Andres Corona, Raoul's advisor, his strategist, the only man who could turn his reckless ambition into something resembling control. If Raoul had a weakness, it was him. The kidnapping was quick, surgical. Andres never saw it coming. One moment he was stepping into his car, the next he was bound, gagged, and dragged into an abandoned warehouse, his pulse hammering against his throat as Isaiah loomed over him, silent, patient, waiting for the panic to settle into real fear. When the gag came off, Andres gasped, eyes darting between Isaiah and Camilla, his voice shaking. You have no idea what you've done. Isaiah leaned closer, his voice a quiet storm. Neither does Raoul. Andres tried to hold on to bravado, but fear had already eaten through his confidence. He'll come for me, he spat. Isaiah tilted his head, slow, deliberate. No, he said. He won't. Silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Andres swallowed. Even his father knows he's out of control, he admitted, the words falling like stones. Diego doesn't trust him anymore. Isaiah and Camilla exchanged a look. That was all they needed to hear. The war had just shifted, and now, Raul Delgado wasn't just fighting them. He was fighting his own blood. The plan wasn't complicated, but it didn't need to be. Isaiah knew how men like Raul operated. Power was built on intimidation, enforced with violence, but maintained through resources. And if Raul's empire was a beast, then its heart was the weapons he supplied to the highest bidders. Taking down his gun warehouse wasn't just about destruction, it was about sending a message. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about control. The location was locked down, tucked away in an industrial district, patrolled by armed men who believed they were invincible because no one had dared to come for them. But they weren't expecting Isaiah King. He had scouted the place for hours, memorizing guard rotations, pinpointing weak spots in their defenses. When the night stretched deep and heavy, he moved, slipping through the shadows with the precision of a man who had spent years mastering the art of war. The first sentry barely had time to register the knife before it was already buried deep in his throat, his body lowering into the darkness without a sound. The second never saw the silenced bullet coming. The third heard something too late and turned just in time to feel Isaiah's grip tighten around his throat, dragging him into the abyss. 3 down. It was enough to break the formation, to slip past the outer defenses and into the belly of the beast. The warehouse was massive, lined with crates stacked to the ceiling, each filled with weapons meant to flood the city with blood. Isaiah moved swiftly, planting explosives along the structural supports, ensuring that when the flames rose, they would consume everything. The last charge was set, the countdown ticking away in his head, but as he turned, the first gunshot shattered the silence. He had been seen. Chaos erupted. Bullets ripped through the air, shattering crates, splintering metal, sending echoes of violence crashing through the cavernous space. Isaiah moved, weaving between cover, returning fire with brutal efficiency. One shot, one kill. He didn't waste bullets. He didn't waste time. He was a force, cutting through them like death given form. The moment the final body dropped, he pressed the detonator. The explosion swallowed the warehouse in a firestorm of steel and fury that Raoul's empire had just lost its lifeline. But Isaiah had barely exhaled when the retaliation came. Raoul wasn't a man to take losses lightly, and his rage was immediate. He didn't come for Isaiah directly. He went for Camilla. She was expecting it. The moment the first hitman stepped into the bar she had been watching, she knew. 5 men, all armed, all thinking they could outmatch her. She let them come close, let them believe she was another easy target. Then she moved. The first man went down with a knife buried in his ribs before he could even raise his weapon. The second caught a bullet between the eyes. The third was smart enough to run. The last 2 tried to fight, but Camilla was faster, colder, ruthless in the way only a woman who had nothing to lose could be. When it was over, she stood amidst the wreckage of their bodies, wiped the blood from her blade, and sent a message straight to Isaiah: "You need to move faster." And that was when Diego Delgado made his move. The call came from a number Isaiah had never expected to see again. The voice on the other end was smooth, calculated, the tone of a man who was used to being feared. "My son is a problem," Diego said. "I need a solution." Isaiah didn't speak. He let the weight of the words settle. "Take him out," Diego continued, "and I'll make sure no one else comes for you." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken consequences. Isaiah wasn't a hitman. He wasn't an errand boy for dying kings. But this wasn't just another job. This was something else. And as the call ended, he realized something. Raul Delgado wasn't just fighting the streets. He was fighting his own blood. And the moment a man lost his father's trust, his empire was already burning. The trap was set long before Isaiah realized he had walked into it, the kind of setup designed by a man who knew he was losing control and needed a victory to stay in power. Raul had anticipated his next move, had dangled bait in the form of a high-profile informant willing to spill everything, and Isaiah had taken it. The meeting point was an abandoned train yard, rusted tracks stretching into nothingness, forgotten by the city but not by the men who had turned it into a battlefield. Isaiah moved through the shadows, his senses sharp, his instincts screaming at him just a second too late. The first gunshot split the silence, followed by another, then another. The space around him erupted in violence. Bullets ricocheted off steel, sending sparks raining down like dying embers. A dozen men, maybe more, spread out across the yard, closing in with military precision. He fired back, dropping 2 before they could take cover, but the numbers weren't in his favor. He moved fast, slipping between shipping containers, using the rusted skeleton of the train yard as his shield. But it wasn't enough. More were coming. The walls were closing in. Camilla had been watching from a rooftop across the yard, sniper rifle steady against her shoulder, waiting for the inevitable. When the shots rang out, she reacted without hesitation, taking down 2 men before the others realized where the fire was coming from. But she wasn't invincible. A sharp crack, the whistle of a bullet, then fire tearing through her side as she stumbled back against the concrete. Blood soaked through her shirt, warm, thick, pooling too fast for her liking. She gritted her teeth, steadying her breathing, forcing herself back into position. She could still fight. She would still fight. Isaiah saw her drop and felt something in his gut twist, something cold and dangerous. He moved faster, calculated, his mind shifting into the brutal efficiency of survival. He reached her in seconds, hands pressing against the wound, feeling the slick heat of her blood against his skin. "Not yet," he muttered, voice low, steady, pulling her up as bullets ripped through the air around them. They moved together, one step at a time, cutting through Raul's men with precision, until finally, the gunfire faded, replaced only by the heavy sound of their breathing. The trap had failed. But just barely. Across the city, Raul Delgado was unraveling. The loss of the warehouse had been a blow, the failed ambush another, but it was the growing whispers, the fear in his men's eyes, the doubt creeping into his ranks that truly sent him over the edge. He had promised dominance, power, an empire carved from blood, and now? Now they looked at him like he was just another man waiting to die. Andres Corona saw it. He had been at Raul's side for years, had watched him rise, had helped him navigate the shifting tides of the underworld. And now he was watching him drown. "We need to regroup," Andres said, voice careful, measured. "Pull back, reassess." The shot rang out before he could finish. A single bullet straight through the skull. Silence fell heavy in the room as Andres crumpled to the floor, the smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. Raul exhaled slowly, eyes burning with something feral, something beyond reason. "I don't need cowards," he muttered. But in his rage, in his carelessness, he hadn't noticed the second body on the ground. One of his father's men. Isaiah didn't gloat when he made the offer. There was no victory in this, no satisfaction. Just the cold reality of the inevitable. He sent the message to Raul through the only channel that mattered. "Walk away and I let you live. Fight and you die." There was no negotiation. No second chances. Raul didn't respond. He didn't need to. The answer was already written in blood. Isaiah inhaled deeply, the weight of everything settling into his bones. He had given Raul a choice. Now it was time to end this. Isaiah moved like a shadow through the city, his body worn but his mind razor-sharp, every step bringing him closer to the inevitable. Raul had nowhere left to run, no more back alleys or safe houses, only a glass tower of wealth and power that had once made him untouchable but was now nothing more than a gilded cage. The penthouse stood atop the skyline, an oasis of excess built on blood money, secured by men who still believed they were defending a king. But kings only ruled until someone stronger came to take the throne. Isaiah watched from the street below, his eyes calculating, tracing every entry point, every blind spot, every flaw in the fortress Raul had surrounded himself with. He had spent his life reading buildings like battlegrounds, and this one was no different. The penthouse wasn't a sanctuary. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. Camilla was beside him, her wounds still fresh, her movements slower than before, but her determination unshaken. She had made her choice the moment she stepped back into this fight, and there was no turning away now. "We do this fast," Isaiah murmured, checking his weapon, feeling the familiar weight settle in his hands. Camilla nodded once, no words needed. They moved as one, slipping through the service entrance, weaving past the checkpoints like ghosts, silent, deadly, inevitable. The first two guards never saw them coming, their bodies dropping before the alarms could be raised. The next wave reacted too slowly, caught between the illusion of safety and the sudden reality of death. Isaiah moved with the precision of a man who had done this too many times to count, his strikes efficient, his bullets placed with the kind of certainty that only experience could bring. Camilla covered his flank, her own skills honed to lethal perfection, the two of them cutting through the penthouse security like a blade through silk. The top floor was waiting, the air thick with tension, with the scent of cigar smoke and expensive whiskey, with the weight of something unspoken yet understood. Raul Delgado stood in the center of it all, his suit disheveled, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but his arrogance still intact. Behind him, another presence lingered, Diego Delgado, his father, the true power behind the name, the man who had built an empire and was now watching his son tear it apart. "I should have killed you myself," Diego murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his voice a quiet storm beneath the chaos. "But I'm giving you the honor." He looked at Isaiah then, a slow nod, a silent command. "End this." Raul laughed, but there was no humor in it, only desperation, only the sharp edge of a man who knew he had already lost but refused to admit it. "You think he's any better than me?" he spat, wiping the sweat from his brow, his hands trembling not with fear, but with the rage of a cornered animal. "You think he's justice? He's just another killer." He lunged before the words had fully settled, the fight exploding in a violent tangle of fists and blood, both men crashing into the glass walls, the city lights spinning in fragments around them. Isaiah took the first hit, a solid blow to the ribs that sent fire through his side, but he absorbed the pain, twisted with it, turned it into momentum. He struck back, elbow driving into Raul's throat, forcing him back, forcing him down, but Raul was relentless, clawing for survival, fighting like a man who knew death was the only thing waiting for him now. They fell, staggered, rose again, blood slicking their skin, their breaths ragged, their bodies screaming for an end. Raoul reached for a knife, desperation turning to blind fury, but Isaiah caught his wrist, twisted hard, heard the sharp crack of bone, heard the ragged gasp of pain, and still, Raoul fought. But Isaiah was done. With one final strike, he drove him to the floor, knee pressing against his chest, the weight of inevitability settling between them. He could end it. Right now. One move, one breath, and it would be over. But justice had never been about revenge. Isaiah exhaled, slow and measured, then stepped back. "He's yours," he said, turning to Diego. Raoul's eyes widened, realization dawning too late. The betrayal had been inevitable. The man who had given him everything was now taking it all away. Isaiah didn't watch as Diego's men closed in, didn't listen to the screams that followed. He had already made his choice. And Raul Delgado was already dead. Raul Delgado's body was found a day later, discarded like an afterthought, his once feared presence reduced to a blood-stained reminder that power never truly belonged to those who couldn't hold on to it. No police reports, no media frenzy, just whispers in the underground, a quiet acknowledgement that his reign had ended the way it was always meant to, cold, brutal, inevitable. Diego Delgado had made his choice, and no one questioned it. His empire remained intact, stronger now without the recklessness of his son threatening to tear it apart. Those who had once followed Raoul now scrambled to realign themselves, to rewrite their loyalties before the dust settled, before Diego decided he had more loose ends to cut. The city's underworld didn't mourn the dead. It simply adjusted. Isaiah watched from a distance, unseen but never unaware, his presence no longer needed in the chaos he had helped create. Raoul had been a symptom, not the disease, and Isaiah had long since accepted that his war wasn't one that could be won in a single battle. But this fight, this personal war, was over. The blood had dried, the bodies had fallen, and what remained was silence, the kind that stretched between lives that should never have crossed. He hadn't saved the city. He had only changed its shape. He stood at the grave of a man who had mattered, a man who had believed in something greater, even when the world had given him every reason not to. Rex had fought for justice, had bled for it, had died for it, and Isaiah had carried the weight of that loss ever since. The headstone was simple, understated, the name carved into the stone holding more weight than any monument ever could. Isaiah traced the letters with his fingers, the chill of the stone grounding him, reminding him why he had started down this path in the first place. "I didn't forget," he murmured, the words lost in the wind. "And I won't." It wasn't a promise. It was a fact. Behind him, footsteps approached, quiet but deliberate, a presence he had already sensed long before she spoke. "You're really leaving, aren't you?" Camilla's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something unspoken, something that didn't need to be said. She had been there through all of it, had bled beside him, had fought beside him, had survived beside him, and now she was choosing to stay. He could see it in the way she stood, in the way she held herself, not as someone lost in the fight, but as someone who had found purpose in it. She wasn't leaving this behind. She couldn't. "You don't have to go," she said, though they both knew that wasn't true. Isaiah exhaled, the weight of too many battles pressing against him, not in exhaustion, but in understanding. He had never belonged in the shadows the way she did. He had walked through them, used them, become something within them, but he had never truly been one of them. This wasn't his world. It never had been. "You know I do," he said, and she didn't argue, because she had always known this was where they parted ways. No dramatic goodbyes, no lingering words, just the quiet acceptance of two people who had walked the same road until it was time to take different paths. The city stretched before him, alive and restless, always shifting, always waiting for the next storm to come. Isaiah Carter had been a part of that storm, a force that had torn through its streets, leaving ghosts and legends in his wake. But now the storm was passing. He walked away, his footsteps fading into the night, leaving behind nothing but silence and the story of a man who never lost. Isaiah had left the city behind, taken nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his past pressing against his shoulders. The air in this place was different, cleaner, free of the constant tension that had followed him for years, but no matter how far he ran, the ghosts came with him. He had found a quiet corner of a forgotten town, a place where no one knew his name, where he wasn't Isaiah Carter, the man who had brought down a crime empire, but just another stranger trying to disappear. He told himself this was what he wanted. No more blood, no more war, just silence, just breathing, just life. But peace wasn't something he had ever learned to hold, and the quiet only made the echoes louder. His body was healing, the bruises fading, the stitches long since removed, but some wounds didn't mend, not really. Every night, he woke up reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, muscles coiled, senses sharp, waiting for an enemy that wasn't coming. Except that was a lie. Enemies always came. He ran 5 miles before sunrise, forced himself through brutal workouts, pushed himself until his limbs ached, but nothing dulled the edge of the knowledge clawing at his mind. This wasn't real. This wasn't his world. No matter how long he tried to pretend, he would never be the man who simply walked away. Then the past came knocking. It started small, the way these things always did. A man watching him too closely from across the diner, a car parked 2 blocks down that never seemed to move, whispers that should have meant nothing but weren't there before. Isaiah didn't ask questions. He just listened. The first real sign came when the back door of his rental house was jimmied open while he was out, the lock picked by someone careful, professional. They had taken nothing, left no message, but Isaiah had spent too many years in the dark to mistake the truth. This was a warning. A reminder that he wasn't as invisible as he wanted to be. So he waited. They came 2 nights later. 3 men, silent, moving like predators, armed but not sloppy, the kind of people sent when someone wanted a problem handled quietly. They didn't expect him to be ready. The first never saw the knife coming, steel sliding between his ribs before he even registered the threat. The second fired, missed, and Isaiah was already moving, already disarming, already breaking bone before the man could so much as scream. The third ran. Smart. But not smart enough. Isaiah caught him before he reached the car, slammed him against the hood, pressed the blade against his throat, and finally asked the question he had been dreading. Who sent you? The answer changed everything. Raul Delgado was dead. That part was true. But Raul had never been the top of the chain. He had been reckless, arrogant, an entitled prince playing at power, but someone had been behind him, feeding him resources, pulling strings in the background. And now that Raul was gone, the real architects of the operation were cleaning house. They had let Isaiah walk away once, perhaps assuming he was too wounded, too tired to be a threat. But now, they weren't taking chances. He was a loose end. And loose ends were meant to be cut. Isaiah didn't kill the man. He sent him back with a message. Tell them they should have finished the job. Because now, Isaiah wasn't running anymore. Isaiah had spent his life believing he understood the game, believing that every move he made had weight, that every enemy he put down meant something, but now the board had shifted, and he wasn't sure he had ever really been playing at all. The name came to him from the lips of a dying man, whispered through blood and fear, Santiago Vega. The real power. The man behind Raul, behind the deals, behind the operations that had stretched far beyond one reckless criminal family. Isaiah had killed a prince, but the king had been watching, waiting, and now the king was coming for him. The deeper he dug, the worse it became. Santiago had been orchestrating crime for decades, not just in one city, not just in one country, but everywhere the money flowed, everywhere power could be bought and sold. He hadn't just controlled Raul, he had controlled dozens like him, warlords, drug lords, politicians with dirty hands and darker secrets, all moving to his silent commands. Isaiah hadn't toppled an empire. He had simply burned down one of many outposts, and now he saw what had always been true. He had never been the hunter. He had always been the hunted. And if that was true, then what had any of it meant? He had fought, he had bled, he had lost everything, and for what? Justice? Vengeance? He had told himself that every bullet fired, every bone broken had been part of something bigger, that the bodies left in his wake had served a purpose, but now, staring at the enormity of what lay ahead, the truth settled like lead in his chest. He had been fighting shadows, scratching at the surface while men like Santiago had been writing the rules. For the first time in a long time, Isaiah wondered if any of it had ever mattered at all. Then he got the call. Camilla's voice wasn't on the other end. It was someone else, someone calm, someone who had waited for him to pick up before delivering the news like a blade slipping into his ribs. They had her. She was still alive, at least for now, but that wasn't the point. They hadn't taken her to kill her. They had taken her to get to him, to remind him of what he had left behind, to show him that no matter how far he ran, he wasn't done. They were baiting him, knowing that he would come, knowing that he wouldn't let her die for his sins. And maybe, for a moment, he thought about not going. Maybe he thought about disappearing, about letting them think he was dead, about cutting the last thread tying him to the life he had sworn to leave behind. Maybe he thought about what it would mean to finally stop, to finally be free. But that wasn't who he was. Isaiah didn't run. He didn't hide. And if Santiago Vega wanted a war, then Isaiah Carter was going to bring him one. Isaiah had spent years fighting battles he thought mattered, but now, standing at the edge of the truth, he realized he had never seen the full picture. The city wasn't just corrupt. It was controlled, its veins filled with the lifeblood of criminals who moved unseen, untouchable, ruling from the shadows with an iron grip. The police, the courts, the politicians, even the men who claimed to stand against them, everyone was a pawn in a game too large to see. Santiago Vega wasn't just a kingpin. He was part of an entire machine, a system designed to keep men like Isaiah fighting endless wars while the true rulers never so much as lifted a hand. But Isaiah wasn't going to fight another war. He was going to end it. The target was clear. The control center, the fortress where Santiago and his kind dictated the fate of the city. It wasn't just a place, it was the beating heart of corruption, where money was moved, deals were struck, and power was passed like an inheritance. There was no storming it through the front doors, no silent infiltration that wouldn't end with a bullet in his skull. No, this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about making sure no one could take the throne again once Santiago fell. This was the last fight, and Isaiah wasn't planning on walking away from it. Gunfire erupted the moment he stepped into the lion's den, but he was already moving, weaving through the chaos, his hands steady, his aim lethal. Bodies dropped around him, men who had spent their lives believing they were untouchable now falling like nameless casualties in a war they never expected to lose. Security scrambled, the alarms screamed, and for the first time, fear rippled through a place that had known only arrogance and control. Isaiah wasn't here to fight them, he was here to erase them. And then he saw her. Camilla, tied to a chair in the center of the chaos, bruised but alive, her eyes locking onto his with something more than just desperation, understanding. She knew what this was. She knew why he was here, why he hadn't come with an escape plan, why there was no running, not this time. He cut her loose with a single motion, shoving a gun into her hands, telling her without words what she needed to do. She fought him, refusing to leave, but there was no time for sentiment. He forced her toward the exit, toward freedom, toward a life outside of this moment, while he turned back to finish what had to be done. Santiago was waiting, standing at the highest level of his empire, staring down at the destruction with something that might have been admiration if it wasn't for the quiet rage in his eyes. He wasn't a man who had ever lost before, and he still didn't believe it was possible. He spoke, but Isaiah didn't hear the words. There was nothing left to say. One shot. That's all it took. The man who had played God over an entire city fell without ceremony, without last words, without the dignity he had stolen from so many. And with his fall, the city would burn with him. Explosives lined the structure, a failsafe Isaiah had set before he ever stepped inside. He had never planned on walking away. He had never planned on giving them another chance to rebuild. A flick of a switch and the world turned white. The sound was deafening, the fire swallowing everything, the walls collapsing, the ground shaking as a dynasty that had lasted generations was reduced to nothing but smoke and rubble. In the days that followed, the city whispered about what had happened. Some said he had died in the fire, a warrior who had gone down with the battlefield he chose. Others claimed they had seen him after, walking away from the wreckage, disappearing into the night, a ghost that could never be caught. No one knew the truth. No one ever would. But one thing was certain: Isaiah Carter was no longer just a man. He was a legend, and the shadows would never forget his name.